Two police cars sat in the driveway, lights off, engines quiet. A woman in a visor and pressed white blouse stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, tapping her foot like she was the one who had called this in, which she had, over a mailbox. The homeowner, a man named Daniel Reyes, stood on his own front porch in socks, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold about 10 minutes earlier. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even upset, not really. He was just watching, almost fascinated, as the woman who had spent the last 6 weeks trying to convince him that his black mailbox violated community aesthetic standards, now tried to convince two uniformed officers that he was somehow the problem. "He's been harassing me," she told the younger officer, her voice cracking just enough to sound convincing. "I feel unsafe in my own neighborhood." The officer looked past her toward Daniel, who raised his coffee mug slightly in greeting, like he was toasting the absurdity of it all. Neither officer looked particularly alarmed. In fact, the older one, a sergeant with about 20 years on the job written into the lines on his face, was already glancing down at a folder in his hand. A folder that hadn't come from the woman. A folder that Daniel had prepared 3 weeks earlier. The moment he realized this wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. Because here's the thing nobody watching the scene would have guessed yet. The woman standing on the sidewalk, the one who had called the police, the one who had spent weeks threatening fines, threatening towing, threatening legal action over a mailbox. She was about to find out that the HOA board she claimed to represent had never actually approved a single thing she'd done. Not the letters. Not the warnings. Not the threats. None of it. She just didn't know that yet. Daniel did. And in about 15 minutes. So would everyone else on that street. This is the story of how a disagreement over a mailbox turned into one of the fastest, cleanest cases of a self-appointed HOA enforcer getting caught completely out of bounds. Not because Daniel fought back with anger, but because he did something far more effective. He simply waited, gathered the facts, and let the truth introduce itself. If you've ever dealt with someone who used a homeowners association as a personal weapon, you're going to want to see exactly how this played out, because the ending is not what most people expect. Daniel Reyes had lived on Larkspur Lane for almost 4 years. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked good in real estate listings, tidy lawns, matching streetlights, a community pool that was open from Memorial Day to Labor Day. When Daniel and his wife bought the house, the HOA fees felt like a reasonable trade-off. Someone else worried about the landscaping on the common areas. Someone else organized the holiday lighting contest. It was low-key, predictable. Nobody bothered anybody. That changed the year Linda Pruitt moved in 3 houses down and not long after joined the HOA board as what she called the Community Standards Liaison. It wasn't an elected position. It wasn't even a position that technically existed in the HOA's official bylaws. But somewhere along the way, Linda had appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of the neighborhood's appearance, and the actual board members, busy, tired, mostly disengaged, let her run with it because it meant one less thing they had to deal with. For the first year, Linda's involvement was mostly harmless. She'd leave friendly notes about trash cans left out too long. She organized a neighborhood cleanup day. People appreciated the initiative, even if she was a little intense about it. Then it became something else. Daniel's property was simple. A single-story brick home with a small front yard, a 2-car driveway, and a black metal mailbox he'd installed himself the year they moved in. The same black metal mailbox, in fact, that 3 other houses on the street also had, because they'd all bought them from the same hardware store during a community-wide sale the HOA itself had promoted 5 years earlier. That detail mattered. It mattered a lot later. One afternoon in early spring, Daniel found a folded piece of paper tucked under his door. It wasn't on official HOA letterhead. It was printed on plain white paper, formatted to look official, with a header that read Community Standards Notice, and a logo that closely resembled the HOA's actual logo, but wasn't quite it. The notice stated that Daniel's mailbox violated Section 4.2 of the Community Aesthetic Guidelines, which required all mailboxes to be a uniform shade of colonial white to maintain consistency along the street. It gave him 14 days to replace the mailbox or face a fine of $200, with additional fines accruing weekly until compliance. Daniel read it twice. Then he did what most reasonable homeowners do when they get a notice like that. He went looking for Section 4.2 in the actual HOA governing documents, the ones he'd been given at closing and had admittedly not looked at closely since. There was no Section 4.2 about mailboxes. There was no mention of mailbox color anywhere in the CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that legally governed what the HOA could and couldn't regulate. There was a general clause about maintaining a neat and orderly appearance, the kind of vague language that shows up in almost every HOA document in the country, but nothing specific. Nothing that named a color. Nothing that mentioned mailboxes at all. Daniel wasn't the type to escalate things immediately. He was patient by nature, the kind of person who preferred to double-check himself before pointing out someone else's mistake. So he assumed reasonably that this was some kind of miscommunication. Maybe a new rule had passed that hadn't made it into his copy of the documents. Maybe there'd been an amendment. He decided to ask. That decision, the simple, polite act of asking a question, was the first domino in a chain of events that would end weeks later, with 2 patrol cars in his driveway and a woman named Linda Pruitt standing on the sidewalk realizing, in real time, that she had built her entire campaign on a rule that didn't exist. But that part was still weeks away. First, Daniel had to actually talk to her, and that conversation did not go the way he expected. Daniel found Linda's contact information on the notice itself, a phone number, no email, which he found a little unusual for something claiming to be an official document. He called on a Tuesday evening, keeping his tone friendly, almost apologetic, the way people do when they're not trying to start a fight, just trying to understand something. "Hi, this is Daniel Reyes, over on Larkspur Lane. I got a notice about my mailbox, and I wanted to ask a quick question about it." "Oh yes," Linda said, her voice immediately shifting into something brisk and businesslike. "The colonial white requirement. It's part of our aesthetic consistency initiative." "I appreciate that," Daniel said. "I just went through my copy of the CC and RS, and I couldn't find anything about mailbox color. Is this a new amendment? I want to make sure I have the current version." There was a pause on the line. Not a long one, but long enough that Daniel noticed it. "It's under General Community Standards," Linda said. "Section 4.2. "I checked Section 4.2, Daniel replied, still calm. "It talks about landscaping maintenance. There's nothing about mailboxes in there." "Well, the board has discretion to interpret the aesthetic guidelines as needed," Linda said, her tone sharpening slightly. "That's literally what the position exists for." Daniel took a breath. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He genuinely wanted to understand how this worked, because if there was a real rule, he'd follow it. That was never in question. What bothered him was the vagueness, the sense that the rule was being invented in real time to fit whatever she wanted. "I hear you," he said, "but if it's not written anywhere, and it's not something the full board voted on, I'm not sure it's something I'm required to comply with. I just want to see the meeting minutes or the amendment where this was approved, if that's possible." "Are you saying you're refusing to comply?" Linda asked, and now there was an edge in her voice that hadn't been there a minute earlier. "I'm saying I'd like to see documentation before I spend money replacing something that meets the standard everyone else on the street has," Daniel said. 3 other houses have the exact same mailbox. The Andersons, the Kapoors, and the Whitfields. If this is a real rule, it should apply to all of us equally, and I'd expect they'd have gotten notices too. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll be sending you a follow-up," Linda said, and hung up before Daniel could respond. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, phone still in his hand, replaying the conversation. Nothing about it had been aggressive on his end. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused her of anything. He'd just asked a reasonable question and gotten a defensive, slightly rattled answer in return. That night, he did something a lot of people in his position don't think to do early enough. He started keeping a folder. He printed the original notice. He wrote down the date and time of the phone call and a summary of what was said. He requested, through email this time, so there'd be a written record, a copy of the HOA's official governing documents, and the most recent meeting minutes. The email bounced back an out-of-office reply, not from the HOA's management company, from Linda personally, because it turned out the address on record for Community Standards Liaison inquiries was her personal email account. not any official HOA channel. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you got a notice like this, vague, unofficial-looking, threatening fines for something that wasn't in your actual HOA documents, how would you have responded? Would you have paid it just to avoid the hassle? Or would you have pushed back and asked to see the actual rule? Daniel chose to push back, calmly and on paper. It felt like the responsible thing to do, not just for himself, but for his neighbors, who he suspected hadn't looked as closely at their own governing documents as he now had. He was right to suspect that. And it wouldn't take long to find out just how far Linda was willing to take this before anyone with real authority stepped in to stop her. 5 days after the phone call, a second notice appeared under Daniel's door. This one was more aggressive in tone. It stated that his continued noncompliance with Section 4.2 had resulted in an escalated fine of $400, and that failure to comply within 7 days would result in the matter being referred to the HOA's legal counsel for further action, including a potential lien against the property. A lien over a mailbox. Daniel read that word a few times. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't going to pretend to be one, but he knew enough to understand that liens were serious, the kind of thing that could complicate a home sale or refinancing down the line. The idea that this could even theoretically be on the table over a mailbox color that appeared nowhere in the actual governing documents felt, frankly, absurd. He also noticed something else in the new notice, a line stating that his vehicle, parked in his own driveway, was in violation of overnight parking restrictions and subject to towing if not moved within 48 hours. His driveway, not the street, his own private driveway, which was unquestionably his property, deeded to him, with no shared easement or HOA claim on it whatsoever. That was the moment Daniel realized this wasn't really about a mailbox anymore. This was about control. Somewhere along the way, being told no, even politely, even reasonably, had turned into something Linda seemed determined not to let stand. He called the HOA's management company directly this time, the actual third-party company listed in his original closing documents, not Linda's personal line. He explained the situation to a representative named Marcus, who sounded politely confused throughout most of the call. "I'm not seeing any board-approved amendment regarding mailbox color," Marcus told him after checking. "And I want to be clear. Towing from a homeowner's private driveway isn't something this HOA has ever had the authority to enforce. That's outside our jurisdiction entirely. Driveways are private property. So the notices I've been getting," Daniel said, "those aren't official HOA communications? They don't appear to be issued through our office," Marcus said carefully. "I'd recommend keeping records of anything you receive. I'm going to flag this internally and loop in the board president." That should have been the end of it. In a reasonable world, that phone call alone would have quietly resolved the entire situation. But 3 days later, Daniel came home from work to find Linda standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, watching him pull in like she'd been waiting. "You called the management company," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Daniel said, stepping out of his car, keeping his voice even. "They told me the notices didn't come from their office, and that there's no rule about mailbox color. They also said HOAs don't have jurisdiction over private driveways." "That's not accurate," Linda said. "I've been doing this for 2 years. I know the rules better than the management company does." "I believe that you believe that," Daniel said, and he meant it as a genuinely neutral statement, not a jab. "But I'd feel a lot better if I could just see it written down somewhere. That's all I've been asking for this whole time." Linda's expression tightened. "You know what, fine. If you want to be difficult about this, I'll handle it a different way." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked back toward her house, phone already in her hand. Does this sound familiar to anyone watching? That moment when someone with a little bit of self-appointed authority starts treating a simple boundary, a request for documentation, a reasonable no, like a personal attack? What do you think the line is between someone being overly enthusiastic about community standards and someone flat out abusing a position they were never even officially given? Daniel didn't know exactly what handling it a different way meant, but he had a guess. And 2 days later, his guess turned out to be right when a patrol car pulled up outside his house for what would become the first of 2 visits from local police over something that, on paper, didn't even qualify as a real HOA violation. The first police visit, as it turned out, was almost a non-event. An officer, a calm, unhurried woman named Officer Delgado, knocked on Daniel's door around 6 in the evening. She explained that a neighbor had called in a report about a disruptive property dispute and a possible trespassing concern regarding a parked vehicle. Daniel invited her in, showed her the notices, walked her through the timeline. Officer Delgado listened without much reaction, the way people do when they've heard 100 versions of the same neighborhood dispute before. "This is a civil matter if it's a matter at all," she told him. "Nothing here rises to a criminal issue. Your vehicle's in your own driveway. That's not something we'd ever get involved in. I'll note the call, but there's nothing for us to act on tonight." She left a card with a case reference number, mostly for Daniel's records, and drove off without any further incident. No citation, no warning, no indication that Daniel had done anything wrong at all. For a few days after that, things went quiet. No new notices appeared under the door. Linda wasn't visible at the end of the driveway when Daniel came home from work. His wife commented that maybe the whole thing had finally blown over, that Linda had realized she didn't have a leg to stand on and decided to let it go. Daniel wanted to believe that too. It would have been easier. But something about the abruptness of the silence didn't sit right with him. In his experience, and admittedly this was new territory for him, he'd never dealt with anything like this before. People who escalate this quickly over something this small don't usually just quietly back down. They regroup. So instead of relaxing completely, Daniel used the quiet week productively. He requested a formal copy of the HOA's CC and RS directly from the county recorder's office. Since HOA governing documents are typically recorded as public record and available regardless of what any individual board member says, he got a certified copy within a few days. He read through the entire document, not just section 4.2, and confirmed what he already suspected. There was no mailbox color requirement anywhere in it, no clause giving any single board member unilateral enforcement authority, and importantly, a clear statement that all fines and enforcement actions had to be approved by a majority vote of the full board and documented in official meeting minutes. He also, out of simple curiosity, looked into whether Community Standards Liaison was a real board-recognized position. It wasn't. It appeared nowhere in the bylaws. As far as the HOA's actual legal structure was concerned, Linda Pruitt held no formal authority whatsoever. She was a homeowner. Nothing more, nothing less, at least not on paper. He printed everything. The certified CC and RS. A dated summary of the phone calls. Copies of both notices. The case number from Officer Delgado's visit. It all went into the same folder, organized and clipped together, sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do with it yet. He just knew, from a quiet instinct he couldn't fully explain, that he'd need it sooner rather than later. He was right. 6 days after the quiet began, it ended, all at once, and with a lot more intensity than the first visit. It was a Saturday morning when the second call came in. Daniel was out front trimming the hedge along his walkway when a patrol car turned onto Larkspur Lane, followed closely by a second one. Both parked near the curb, not blocking his driveway, and 2 officers stepped out, Officer Delgado again, along with an older sergeant Daniel hadn't met before, whose name tag read Whitmore. Before either officer reached the porch, Linda came power walking down the sidewalk from her house, phone still in hand, already talking. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. This is the individual I told you about. He's been harassing me for weeks, calling my personal phone, showing up near my property. I've told him repeatedly to stop, and he refuses." Daniel set down his hedge trimmers slowly and stood, saying nothing yet, letting her finish. Sergeant Whitmore glanced at Daniel, then back at Linda. "Ma'am, can you clarify what specifically happened today that prompted the call?" "He's been sending threatening emails about the HOA process," Linda said, "and he's refusing to comply with community standards violations, and now he's out here doing yard work in a clearly aggressive manner, which feels targeted." Sergeant Whitmore's expression didn't change. "Doing yard work. He knows what he's doing," Linda said. "He's trying to intimidate me." Officer Delgado, recognizing Daniel and the address, spoke up quietly to her sergeant. "I responded to a call at this address about a week ago. Similar complaint. There wasn't anything actionable at that time." Sergeant Whitmore nodded slowly and turned to Daniel. "Sir, would you mind stepping over here and walking us through your side of things?" "Not at all," Daniel said, and calmly reached down to pick up the folder he'd left on the porch step earlier that morning. The same folder he'd been building for 2 weeks, almost as if some part of him had known today might be the day it would matter. Have you ever seen something like this happen? Police getting called out over something this minor? A mailbox, a driveway, yard work? Where do you personally think the line should be for what's actually worth involving the police over, versus what should just stay a conversation between neighbors or go through an HOA's normal process? Daniel opened the folder and started calmly from the beginning. He explained the original notice. He explained that he'd checked the actual governing documents and found no such rule. He explained the phone call with the management company and read off the case number Officer Delgado had given him the week before. He handed over the certified copy of the CC and RS, open to the relevant section, so both officers could see for themselves that no mailbox provision existed anywhere in it. Linda's voice rose slightly. "That's an outdated copy. The board updated the aesthetic guidelines this year." "This is a certified copy from the county recorder's office," Daniel said, still even, still unhurried. "Dated 3 days ago. If there's a more recent amendment, it would need to be recorded too, and I'd be glad to see it if you have a copy." Silence. Sergeant Whitmore took the folder from Daniel and started flipping through it himself, unbothered, thorough, the way a sergeant with 2 decades of experience naturally handles every complaint, assuming nothing, checking everything. "This document you sent," Sergeant Whitmore said, holding up the original notice Linda had left under Daniel's door. "It says Section 4.2. I don't see a Section 4.2 addressing mailboxes anywhere in this certified copy." "The board grants discretion for aesthetic interpretation," Linda said quickly. "Is that written anywhere?" Whitmore asked, still calm, still neutral, the kind of question that wasn't accusatory, just factual. "It's implied," Linda said. "Ma'am, are you a member of the HOA board?" he asked. There was a pause. A real one this time, long enough that Officer Delgado glanced over. "I'm the Community Standards Liaison," Linda said. "Is that an elected or board-appointed position?" "It's more of a volunteer role I took on." "So you're not on the board," Whitmore clarified, not unkindly, just plainly. "I handle a lot of the day-to-day enforcement," Linda said, her voice noticeably less certain now than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply reached back into the folder and pulled out the printed email exchange with Marcus from the management company, the one confirming that the notices hadn't come from their office, and handed it over. Sergeant Whitmore read it, then looked up. "This says the management company has no record of authorizing these notices, and that towing from a private driveway isn't within the HOA's authority at all. I was trying to help maintain property values for the whole street," Linda said. "Somebody has to enforce standards, or the neighborhood falls apart." "I understand wanting to help maintain the neighborhood," Whitmore said, his tone still professional, still even. "But issuing fines and threatening liens without board authorization and calling for police response over a civil disagreement that's already been addressed once, that's a different issue." He was clearly hostile, Linda said, gesturing toward Daniel, who was standing quietly with his hands at his sides, hedge trimmers still resting by his foot where he'd set them down. Officer Delgado spoke up gently. "Ma'am, I was here last week. Mr. Reyes was calm and cooperative during that visit as well. There's no pattern of hostility on his end that either of us has observed." Linda didn't respond right away. She glanced toward her own house, then back at the folder in Whitmore's hands, as if she were only now realizing how thin the ground under her had become. Do you think at this point Linda expected any of this to backfire on her? Or do you think she genuinely believed she'd get away with it, the same way she apparently had for the past year and a half? Whitmore closed the folder and handed it back to Daniel. "I'm not going to issue anything today. This isn't a criminal matter, and it's not something we have jurisdiction over. But I would strongly recommend, ma'am, that you stop issuing notices and threats that haven't been authorized by your actual HOA board. That kind of thing can open you up to real legal exposure, not from us, but from him or from the HOA itself if they decide your actions have created liability for them. The next development didn't come from the police at all. It came 4 days later in the form of an official email, this time genuinely from the HOA's management company, sent not just to Daniel, but to the entire street. The email stated in careful formal language that the board had become aware of unauthorized enforcement notices being issued under the HOA's name by an individual not authorized to act on the board's behalf. It clarified that no such position as Community Standards Liaison existed within the HOA's official structure, that no amendment regarding mailbox color had ever been passed, and that any resident who had received similar notices should disregard them entirely. It went on to state that the board would be conducting a review of all communications issued over the past year under Linda's name, and reminded all residents that only the management company and the elected board were authorized to issue enforcement notices or fines. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't post anything online, didn't knock on Linda's door to say anything about it. He simply filed the email in the same folder, closed it, and went back to his weekend. What he did learn later, mostly through casual conversation with the Andersons a few houses down, was that Linda had, in fact, sent similar notices to at least 6 other homes over the past year, some over mailbox color, one over a garden gnome deemed not in keeping with community tone, another over a basketball hoop that had been sitting in the same spot for 3 years without issue. Most of those homeowners had simply paid the fines rather than deal with the hassle of pushing back. The board, once alerted, quietly refunded every fine that had been collected without proper authorization. Linda was asked to step away from any informal enforcement role entirely. She wasn't removed from a neighborhood. She still lived there, still attended the community pool in the summer. But her ability to act as an unofficial enforcer, the thing that had apparently given her a sense of authority for over a year, was gone. Do you think Linda ever expected it to end this way, with the very HOA she claimed to be protecting turning around and cutting her off? It's worth thinking about, because so often these situations start with someone genuinely believing they're doing the right thing, protecting property values, keeping the neighborhood in order. And it's the overreach, not the original intention, that ends up costing them everything. A few weeks passed. The mailbox stayed exactly where it was, exactly the color it had always been. Daniel's driveway remained, unsurprisingly, his own private property, free of tow trucks, free of notices, free of anything resembling drama. Life on Larkspur Lane went back to something resembling normal. The Andersons thanked Daniel privately for pushing back the way he had, admitting they'd paid a fine themselves the year before just to avoid the headache, and felt a little foolish about it in hindsight, though Daniel was quick to point out there was nothing foolish about wanting to avoid conflict. Most people do. It's a completely reasonable instinct. What made the difference in Daniel's case wasn't aggression. It wasn't confrontation for its own sake. It was patience, documentation, and a willingness to simply ask, calmly and repeatedly, for something to be shown in writing. That's really all it took to unravel the entire situation. Not a dramatic showdown, not a shouting match, just consistent, quiet persistence in the face of pressure that was never actually backed by real authority in the first place. The HOA board, to their credit, handled the correction professionally once they were made aware. They didn't need to be pushed into it with threats or public shaming. A calm, well-documented email was enough. And that, in the end, is the quiet lesson underneath a story like this. Authority, real authority, comes from documentation, from process, from things written down and agreed upon by the people who actually have the standing to agree to them. Not from confidence, not from persistence, and certainly not from a self-appointed title on a piece of paper that looks official but isn't. At the end of the day, this wasn't a story about revenge, and it wasn't really a story about a mailbox either. It was a story about what happens when someone mistakes enthusiasm for authority, and what happens when a homeowner, calm, patient, and simply unwilling to be pushed around, decides to ask one simple question and keep asking it until he gets a real answer. Daniel didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was right, and because he took the time to prove it. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. There are a lot more stories like this one coming. Situations where a small disagreement spirals into something much bigger, and the people involved find out the hard way where the real lines of authority actually sit. We'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or someone who tried to enforce a rule that turned out not to even exist? What happened, and how did you handle it? Your stories are often just as wild as the ones we cover here, so don't be shy.